Hey everyone, I never thought I'd be writing something like this, but I need to get this off my chest. My name's Alex, I'm 34, and I live in Seattle. I work in marketing at a mid-sized tech company, the kind of job that keeps me busy but pays well enough to live comfortably. Life's been good, or at least it was good, until recently that I met my wife, Jenna, about 9 years ago at a mutual friend's party. She was charming, witty, and had this magnetic energy that drew people in. I was hooked from the start. We dated for a couple of years before getting married, and for a while, it felt like we were the perfect match. Jenna worked as an interior designer, and her creativity always inspired me. We shared a lot of the same interests: traveling, trying out new restaurants, and binge-watching bad reality TV shows on lazy Sundays, but over the last year, things started to shift. Jenna became more distant, more irritable over small things that never used to bother her. She'd roll her eyes when I told her about my day, or brush me off when I tried to make plans for us. At first, I thought it was just stress from work. She'd taken on more clients and seemed to be constantly busy. But then came the girls' nights that lasted way too late, the sudden weekend work trips, and the constant texting that she always seemed to hide when I walked into the room. That I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I trusted her, we'd been through so much together, and I never thought she'd betray that. But deep down, I knew something was off. There's a certain look people get when they're hiding something, and Jenna had it. Little did I know, the truth was worse than anything I could have imagined. The turning point came on an ordinary Thursday evening, one of those nights when Jenna said she had to stay late for a client consultation. I didn't think much of it at first. These late nights had become more frequent, and I had convinced myself it was just her workload piling up. But that night, she left her tablet at home. Now, Jenna never left her tablet behind. It had her schedules, notes, and everything she needed for work. That's when the first real crack of suspicion hit me. I sat on the couch, staring at the tablet like it was some forbidden object. I'm not the kind of guy who snoops. I've always believed in trust, in giving each other space. But something didn't sit right. My gut was screaming at me that something was off. After what felt like an eternity of debating with myself, I gave in and powered it on. At first, I told myself I'd just check her calendar to confirm the client meeting. But curiosity, or maybe it was dread, pushed me further. I opened her messages. That's when my world shattered. There were dozens of messages between Jenna and Chris. At first, I thought it might be a client. But as I scrolled, the tone of the messages made it glaringly obvious that Chris wasn't just a client. Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you. You're the best part of my day. I hate sneaking around, but I love the excitement. My heart dropped into my stomach. Chris wasn't just anyone. He was my colleague. The same Chris I'd worked with for years, shared office lunches with, and considered a friend. The betrayal wasn't just from Jenna, it was from someone I trusted in my professional life as well. I kept scrolling, hoping, praying that there was some misunderstanding. But the more I read, the more the truth sank in. Jenna and Chris had been having an affair for months. They'd been sneaking around, making excuses, laughing behind my back while I went about my life, oblivious to the deception happening under my nose. I closed the tablet and sat there in silence, my mind racing. How could she do this? How could he do this? The woman I loved and the colleague I trusted had both stabbed me in the back, and I never saw it coming. That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat in the dark, waiting for Jenna to come home, my mind replaying every moment, every sign I might have missed. When she finally walked through the door, everything changed. When Jenna finally walked through the door that night, I was sitting on the couch, the tablet resting on the coffee table in front of me like a loaded weapon. My heart was pounding, but my mind was eerily calm. I'd spent the last few hours rehearsing what I was going to say, but when I saw her acting like everything was normal, my words caught in my throat. She didn't even notice me at first. She kicked off her shoes, hung her coat on the rack, and casually glanced at her phone. That's when she saw the tablet. "Oh," she said, pausing in the hallway. I must have left that here. Her tone was so nonchalant, like she hadn't just detonated a bomb in our marriage. I couldn't believe the nerve that I cleared my throat, and she finally looked up, her eyes meeting mine. For a split second, I saw the flicker of panic, the realization that something was wrong. But she covered it up quickly, plastering on that fake smile she'd perfected. "Hey, babe," she said, like we were just two people going about their normal evening. "You're still up?" I stared at her, letting the silence stretch between us. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she'd done. "I read your messages," I finally said, my voice low and steady, her face drained of color. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. For a moment, I thought she might admit it right there, that maybe just maybe she'd own up to what she'd done, but of course, she didn't. "What are you talking about?" she said, forcing a laugh that sounded like nails on a chalkboard. "You went through my stuff?" I couldn't believe it. She was deflecting. I was the bad guy now for looking through her tablet. "Don't do that," I snapped. "Don't turn this around on me. I saw everything, Jenna. The messages with Chris. The late-night meetings. The lies." Her expression hardened. The mask slipped, and there she was, the real Jenna. Cold. Calculating. "It's not what you think," she said, crossing her arms over her chest. "Chris and we're just friends. You're blowing this out of proportion." I felt my blood boil. "Friends?" That's the line she was going with. "Friends don't send messages like that," I shot back. "Friends don't sneak around behind their husbands' backs. How long has this been going on, Jenna? Just tell me the truth." But she didn't. She just stood there, silent, her eyes darting around like she was looking for an escape. That I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "You know what? It doesn't even matter. I don't need an explanation. I don't need you." Her eyes narrowed. "Oh, so you're just going to throw everything away over a misunderstanding?" I laughed a bitter, hollow laugh. "A misunderstanding? Jenna, you've been cheating on me with my colleague. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a choice." She rolled her eyes, like I was the one being unreasonable. "Maybe if you hadn't been so busy with work all the time, I wouldn't have had to find attention somewhere else." That hit me harder than anything else. She wasn't just denying it, she was blaming me. As if my commitment to our life, to providing for us, had somehow justified her betrayal. That I shook my head, feeling a strange sense of clarity wash over me. This wasn't the woman I married. The Jenna I fell in love with wouldn't have lied, cheated, and gaslit me. That woman was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. "I'm done," I said quietly. "I'll be staying at Jake's for a while. I'll come back for my stuff when I'm ready." She didn't say anything as I grabbed my keys and walked out the door. No apologies, no attempts to stop me. Just silence. As I drove to my friend's place, the reality of what had happened started to sink in. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was the realization that the life I thought I had was a lie. The woman I loved, the future we'd planned, the trust we'd built, it was all gone. When I got to Jake's, he opened the door and took one look at me before pulling me into a hug. I'm not usually the emotional type, but in that moment, I let go. All the anger, the heartbreak, the disbelief, it poured out of me like a flood. That night, as I lay on his couch, staring at the ceiling, I felt empty. The person I was when I walked into that house earlier that evening didn't exist anymore. And I had no idea who I was supposed to be now. But one thing was clear. This was just the beginning of the fallout. The next morning hit me like a freight train. Waking up on Jake's couch wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a stark reminder that my entire life had been turned upside down. The house felt foreign, the smell of freshly brewed coffee in Jake's kitchen made me feel out of place, like I was some uninvited guest in my own reality. Jake, being the solid friend he is, didn't push me to talk. He handed me a mug, sat down across from me, and let the silence stretch until I was ready. But I wasn't ready. Not to talk, not to process. I was still in survival mode, trying to piece together how everything unraveled so fast. Around noon, my phone buzzed. I stared at it for a long time before picking it up, already knowing who it was. Jenna. First a text, "Can we talk?" Then another, "I think you're overreacting. Let's not make this more dramatic than it needs to be." Overreacting. That word made my blood boil. I catch her cheating on me with my colleague, and I'm the one being dramatic? I didn't respond. I couldn't. I needed space, not just from her, but from everything that reminded me of the mess I was now living in. But ignoring her didn't mean she'd stop. Later that evening, she called. And called again. Then came the voicemails. The first few were calm, almost dismissive, like she was doing me a favor by offering to clear things up. But as I ignored her calls, the tone shifted. By the fifth voicemail, her frustration was obvious. "I don't know why you're being so stubborn, Alex. We can work through this. You're just hurt, but we can fix it." Fix it? As if slapping some metaphorical duct tape over our shattered marriage would make everything fine. That I spent the next few days in a fog, going through the motions but feeling like I was watching someone else live my life. Work became a minefield. Seeing Chris at the office was like being punched in the face repeatedly. He acted like nothing had happened, like he wasn't the reason my life was in shambles. That I wanted to confront him, to drag him out in front of everyone and expose him for the lying, backstabbing person he was. But I didn't. Not yet. I needed a plan. I needed to be smart about this. Meanwhile, Jenna didn't let up. She sent flowers to Jake's place as if flowers could erase betrayal. She left notes on my car, texted me relentlessly, each message swinging between apologies and accusations. One minute she was sorry, the next she was blaming me again. It wasn't until I got an email from her that I realized how desperate she was becoming. "I know you're hurting, but don't throw everything away over one mistake. We can get through this, Alex. We've built too much together to let it go now." One mistake? No, this wasn't a mistake. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or leaving the milk out overnight. This was a calculated, deliberate choice. Repeated. Over months. The more she tried to minimize it, the clearer it became that she didn't regret the affair, she regretted getting caught. After a week of silence from my end, I finally responded. I needed to confront her, not for her sake, but for mine. I needed closure, even if it was messy. "I'll come by tomorrow to get the rest of my stuff. We'll talk then." Her reply was immediate, "Okay. I'll be here." The next day, I drove back to what used to be our home. Pulling into that driveway felt like walking into enemy territory. The house looked the same, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. Every window, every brick was soaked in betrayal. I walked in, and there she was, sitting on the couch like she hadn't burned our life to the ground. She stood up when she saw me, her eyes wide, like she wasn't sure what version of me was going to walk through that door. "Alex," she started, her voice soft, as if that would make a difference. I didn't let her finish. "Don't. Just don't." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Can we at least talk about this?" "There's nothing to talk about," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "You made your choices. I'm just here for my stuff." But Jenna wasn't one to give up control so easily. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she muttered. "It was just, things between us weren't the same. You were always busy with work." I felt alone. There it was again, the blame. As if my commitment to our future justified her betrayal. "You felt alone, so you decided to cheat? With Chris of all people? Do you even realize how messed up that is?" My voice was rising now, the anger bubbling to the surface. She crossed her arms, her defensiveness kicking in. "I didn't plan for this to happen, Alex. But you weren't there for me." I stared at her, realizing that this conversation wasn't going anywhere. She wasn't sorry. She didn't even fully grasp what she'd done. And that hurt more than anything. I'm done, I said, grabbing the last of my things. You can rationalize this however you want, but I'm not sticking around to listen. As I walked out the door, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was over. Not just the marriage, but the constant battle of trying to make sense of something senseless that I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: whatever came next, it would be on my terms. Leaving the house for what I knew would be the last time was surreal. It wasn't just about packing my things and walking out the door, it was about letting go of an entire chapter of my life. Every photo on the wall, every piece of furniture, even the smell of the place, it all felt like a cruel reminder of how easily everything could be ripped away. I drove back to Jake's in silence, Max sitting in the passenger seat with his head out the window. I envied him for a moment. Dogs don't worry about betrayal. They don't question trust. They just live in the moment, blissfully unaware of the complicated mess humans make of their lives. When I got back, Jake was waiting with a beer and that same look of concern he'd been wearing since I showed up at his door. We didn't talk much that night. We didn't need to. Sometimes just having someone there, breathing the same air, is enough to keep you from falling apart, but falling apart was inevitable. It hit me 2 days later, out of nowhere. I was in the middle of folding laundry, the most mundane task imaginable, and suddenly, it was like the weight of everything I'd been holding back came crashing down. I sat on the floor, surrounded by a pile of clean clothes, and just lost it. I'm not ashamed to admit it. Crying isn't weakness. It's release. And God, I needed that release. For hours afterward, I felt numb. I kept replaying every moment in my head, every sign I missed, every time I dismissed my gut feeling, because I trusted her. I trusted them both. And they threw that trust away like it was nothing. That I kept wondering, was there a moment I could have done something differently? Could I have saved us if I'd just paid more attention? But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't about me. It never was. Jenna made her choices. Chris made his. Their betrayal wasn't a reflection of my shortcomings, it was a reflection of their character. A few days later, I decided I couldn't avoid the office forever. I had to face Chris. I couldn't let him keep walking around like nothing happened, pretending he wasn't a complete scumbag. Walking into that office felt like walking into a battlefield. Every hallway, every desk felt tainted. I could feel the stares, the whispers. Word travels fast in places like this, and while I hadn't told anyone the details, people knew something was off. And then there he was. Chris. Sitting at his desk, laughing at something on his screen like he didn't just tear my life apart. The audacity of it made my blood boil. I walked right up to him, my heart pounding in my chest. He looked up, and for a split second, I saw the guilt flash in his eyes. But then he covered it up with that smug little grin I'd come to hate. "Hey, man," he said like nothing was wrong. "How's it going? How's it going?" Was he serious? I leaned in, keeping my voice low but firm. "You're lucky we're in this office, Chris. Because if we weren't, I'd make sure you felt every bit of the betrayal you put me through." His grin faded, replaced by a nervous chuckle. "Come on, Alex. It wasn't personal. Things just happened." Wasn't personal? This was my wife. My life. And he had the nerve to act like it was some casual fling. I straightened up, shaking my head. "You're pathetic. I hope she was worth it." And with that, I walked away. I didn't need to hear his excuses. I didn't need to waste another second of my life on him. But the confrontation didn't bring the closure I hoped it would. It didn't erase the anger, the hurt, or the sense of betrayal. It was just another step in a long, painful process. Over the next few weeks, I started to rebuild. Little things at first: finding a new apartment, getting back into hobbies I'd abandoned during the marriage, reconnecting with friends I'd unintentionally drifted from. It's funny how you don't realize how much you've lost yourself in a relationship until it's over. I picked up my camera again, something I hadn't touched in years. I started hiking on the weekends, letting the fresh air and the rhythm of my footsteps clear my mind. And slowly, I began to feel like myself again. Not the version of me that was married to Jenna, but the person I was before all of this. The person I was always meant to be, but healing isn't a straight line. There were days when the weight of everything still felt suffocating. Days when I'd see a couple holding hands on the street and feel that familiar sting of loss. Days when I'd wonder if I'd ever be able to trust someone again, and then there were the unexpected moments like the day I ran into Rachel. Rachel was a friend of Jenna's, someone I hadn't seen since the whole thing blew up. She spotted me at a coffee shop, and before I could even decide if I wanted to acknowledge her, she was at my table. "Hey, Alex," she said softly. "I heard about everything. I'm so sorry." I nodded, unsure of what to say. But then we started talking, and it felt surprisingly easy. She knew what had happened, but she didn't look at me with pity, just understanding. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't carrying this burden alone. We ended up talking for hours, sharing stories, laughing at stupid things, and somewhere in that conversation, I realized something important. The betrayal wasn't the end of my story. It was just a painful chapter in a much bigger book. And while I didn't know what the next chapter would hold, I knew one thing for sure: I was ready to turn the page. Life after betrayal is strange. You wake up expecting the world to feel different, but everything looks the same. The sun still rises, traffic still clogs the streets, people still go about their lives as if nothing has changed. But inside, you're a mess of broken pieces trying to figure out how to fit together again. Moving into my new apartment felt like both an end and a beginning. It was small, barely furnished, and quieter than I was used to, but it was mine. No reminders of Jenna, no ghosts of shared memories lurking in every corner. Just a blank slate, waiting for me to write the next chapter. The first few weeks were tough. Loneliness crept in when I least expected it. I'd catch myself reaching for my phone to text Jenna about something funny I saw, only to remember I didn't have that person anymore. The silence was deafening at times, and even Max seemed to sense the shift. He stuck closer to me, his quiet companionship grounding me when my thoughts started to spiral. Work was no easier. Facing Chris every day was like walking into a battlefield without armor. I'd mastered the art of pretending fake smiles in meetings, casual nods in the hallway, but inside, I was simmering. He acted like nothing had happened, like he wasn't the reason my marriage had crumbled. But I wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of seeing me crack. One afternoon, after a particularly tense meeting where Chris had the audacity to crack jokes like we were still buddies, Jake pulled me aside. "Dude, you can't keep bottling this up," he said. "You've got to let it out before it eats you alive." I knew he was right. The anger, the betrayal, the unanswered questions, they were all festering inside me, poisoning everything. But I didn't know how to let it go. Part of me didn't want to let it go. Holding on to that anger felt like the only connection I had to the life I'd lost. Then something unexpected happened. I got a message from Rachel, the same Rachel I'd run into at the coffee shop. We'd stayed in touch since that day, our conversations becoming a strange sort of therapy. She understood the betrayal in a way no one else could, and talking to her felt like peeling back layers of grief I didn't even know I was carrying. Her message was simple: "You free tonight? I've got a bottle of wine and a lot to vent about." I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I was ready for whatever this was turning into. But the truth was, I needed the distraction. I needed to feel something other than anger and sadness. We met at her place, a cozy apartment filled with mismatched furniture and the warm, inviting smell of lavender. We talked for hours, trading stories about our exes, laughing at the absurdity of it all. It was the first time in months I felt like I could breathe. As the night wore on, the conversation shifted from our pasts to our futures. For the first time, I started to imagine a future that wasn't defined by what had happened to me. A future where Jenna and Chris were just footnotes in a much larger story. Before I left, Rachel looked at me and said something that stuck with me: "You're stronger than you think, Alex. This doesn't define you. It's just a chapter, not the whole book." Her words echoed in my mind as I walked home that night. She was right. I'd spent so much time letting Jenna and Chris's betrayal dictate my life, but it didn't have to be that way. I was the one holding on to the pain, and I was the only one who could decide when to let it go. The next morning, I made a decision that I walked into the office, straight past Chris's desk, and into my boss's office. I laid everything out: the affair, the tension, the impossibility of working with someone who had crossed such personal and professional boundaries. I didn't know what I expected, but the relief of finally speaking my truth was worth it. To my surprise, my boss was understanding. Turns out, I wasn't the first person Chris had screwed over, figuratively and literally. A few weeks later, Chris was quietly let go under the guise of restructuring. It wasn't the dramatic showdown I'd fantasized about, but it was enough. Justice, in its own quiet way, with Chris out of the picture and Jenna fading into the background of my life, things started to shift. The weight on my chest felt lighter, the anger less consuming. I found myself smiling more, laughing without that nagging voice in the back of my head reminding me of what I'd lost. Rachel and I kept seeing each other not in a romantic way, but in that rare, comforting space where two broken people find healing in shared scars. She became my anchor, my reminder that life doesn't end with betrayal. It begins again, in ways you never expect, and that's when I realized something profound: the worst thing that ever happened to me wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new one. One where I was stronger, wiser, and finally in control of my own narrative. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. By the time a couple of months had passed, the storm that had wrecked my life felt like it was finally starting to calm. But healing isn't linear, and moving forward wasn't as simple as packing up my stuff and pretending the past didn't exist. The betrayal had seeped into every corner of my life, from my trust in people to how I saw myself in the mirror, but something had changed. I wasn't waking up with that heavy knot in my chest every morning anymore. The rage that once burned so hot had cooled into something quieter: an acceptance, maybe, or just exhaustion from carrying it for so long. Work became easier after Chris was fired. No more forced small talk, no more pretending I was fine while my insides twisted every time I passed his desk. His absence felt like fresh air in a room that had been suffocating me for months. People in the office knew something had gone down, but I kept the details to myself. The drama wasn't worth revisiting, but the biggest shift wasn't at work. It was in me. I started focusing on the things that made me feel like me again. Photography became my therapy. I spent weekends exploring the outskirts of Seattle, capturing landscapes and candid street shots that reminded me the world was still beautiful, even when people weren't. Through the lens of my camera, I started seeing life differently. It wasn't just about getting through the day anymore, it was about finding pieces of joy in unexpected places. And then there was Rachel. Our friendship grew naturally. What started as two people bonding over mutual heartbreak turned into something I didn't quite expect. She wasn't just a reminder of the pain, she was a reminder that life could still surprise me in good ways, too. We spent evenings cooking random recipes we found online, laughing over burnt dinners, and sharing stories that had nothing to do with our exes. One night, after a long day, we ended up on my balcony with a couple of beers, watching the city lights flicker against the night sky. The conversation drifted from casual to deep without us even realizing it. "Do you ever think about dating again?" Rachel asked, her voice soft but curious. I stared out at the skyline, thinking about her question. The idea of dating felt foreign, like trying to speak a language I hadn't used in years. But I wasn't as opposed to it as I thought I'd be. "Yeah," I admitted after a moment. "But it's hard to imagine trusting someone again, you know?" She nodded, her eyes reflecting the same mix of fear and hope I felt. "I get that. But I don't know, I think we learn from the people who hurt us. Not just about them, but about ourselves." I looked at her then, really looked at her, and realized she was right. The pain, the betrayal, it hadn't destroyed me. It had reshaped me. Made me more aware of what I deserved and what I wouldn't tolerate. As the weeks turned into months, life kept moving. I met new people, took on new projects at work, and even started considering travel again. But through it all, Rachel was there, a constant in the whirlwind of change. Then, one evening, something shifted. We were at her place, halfway through a bottle of wine, when she leaned over to grab something from the table and our hands brushed. It was such a small, innocent moment, but it felt like electricity shot through me. She paused, her eyes meeting mine, and in that split second, I knew things between us had changed. Neither of us said anything right away. We just sat there, the air thick with unspoken words. But eventually, she broke the silence. "Alex," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I don't want to mess this up. But I think I feel something more." My heart pounded in my chest. I hadn't expected this, hadn't planned for it, but it felt right. For the first time since everything with Jenna fell apart, I felt excited about the possibility of more. "I feel it too," I admitted, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. "But I don't want to rush anything. We've both been through enough." She smiled, that warm, genuine smile that had become my favorite thing in the world. "We'll figure it out." And we did. Slowly, carefully, we navigated the shift from friends to something more. It wasn't perfect, we were both scarred, both hesitant, but it was real. And that made all the difference. Looking back, I realized that Jenna and Chris's betrayal had been the catalyst for a life I never would have found otherwise. They broke me, yes. But in breaking, I discovered a version of myself I didn't know existed, stronger, wiser, and more open to the unexpected beauty life had to offer. And Rachel? She wasn't just part of my story. She was the beginning of a new chapter. One where I wasn't defined by the people who hurt me, but by the resilience that came from surviving them. As we sat on that balcony, watching the sunrise creep over the horizon, I knew one thing for sure: the best parts of my story were still ahead of me. It's funny how life keeps moving forward even when you feel like you've been standing still. Months had passed since the confrontation with Jenna, and yet, in some ways, it felt like a lifetime ago. The anger had dulled, the heartbreak had faded, and in its place was something I hadn't expected: peace. Rachel and I had found a rhythm together, a balance between our past wounds and our present happiness. We weren't rushing into anything, but the connection between us was undeniable. It was different from what I had with Jenna. There was no pretense, no need to be anything other than exactly who we were: two people who had been through the ringer and come out the other side stronger. One evening, as we were walking Max through the park, Rachel turned to me with a mischievous smile. "So, when are you going to take me on a real date, Alex?" I laughed, the sound feeling natural and unforced. I thought all our nights of burned pasta and bad wine counted as dates. She nudged me playfully. "Those were survival meals. I'm talking about a real date." The idea both excited and terrified me. Dating felt like stepping into uncharted territory, but with Rachel, it didn't feel so daunting. So, I planned something simple: a dinner at a cozy little restaurant we both liked, followed by a walk along the waterfront. The night of our first official date, I found myself more nervous than I expected. But as soon as I saw Rachel, all those nerves melted away. She had this way of grounding me, making me feel like everything was going to be okay, no matter what. Dinner was filled with laughter and easy conversation. We talked about everything and nothing, and for the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely happy. After dinner, we walked along the water, the city lights reflecting off the waves. The air was cool, but not uncomfortably so, and the silence between us felt comfortable, not awkward. At one point, Rachel stopped and turned to me, her eyes soft and thoughtful. "You know," she said quietly, "if someone had told me a year ago that I'd be here, with you, I wouldn't have believed them." I smiled, feeling the same disbelief. "Yeah, me neither. But I'm glad we are." She reached for my hand, her fingers intertwining with mine. That simple gesture felt like a promise, an unspoken understanding that whatever had happened in the past didn't define us. We were writing our own story now, and for the first time, it felt like the right one. As the weeks went by, our relationship deepened. We shared more of ourselves, the good and the bad, the hopes and the fears. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when the ghosts of our pasts tried to creep back in, but we faced them together. We didn't let the mistakes of others dictate our future. One evening, as we sat on my couch, Max curled up between us, Rachel turned to me with a serious expression. "Do you ever think about her? About Jenna?" Her question caught me off guard, but I appreciated her honesty. Avoiding the topic wouldn't make it go away, and pretending it didn't affect me would be a lie. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But not in the way you might think. I don't miss her. I don't miss what we had. But I do think about how different things could have been if she'd been honest, if she'd been the person I thought she was." Rachel nodded, her hand resting on mine. "I get that. It's not about missing them, it's about mourning the idea of what we thought we had." Her words resonated deeply. It wasn't Jenna I missed, it was the life I thought we were building together. But the truth was, that life was never real. It was built on lies and betrayal, and no amount of wishing could change that. "I'm glad it happened, though," I said after a moment. Rachel raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "You're glad?" I nodded, a small smile playing on my lips. "If it hadn't happened, I wouldn't have found my way here. I wouldn't have met you." She smiled back, her eyes shining with warmth. "Well, in that case, I guess I'm glad too." As the months turned into a year, our lives continued to intertwine. We traveled together, explored new places, and built new memories that weren't tainted by the past. And through it all, I realized something important: betrayal doesn't have to break you. It can be the catalyst for growth, for discovering parts of yourself you never knew existed. It can teach you about resilience, about the strength you didn't know you had, and in my case, it led me to Rachel. One evening, as we sat on the same balcony where we'd shared so many late-night conversations, I looked at her and felt a sense of clarity wash over me. "I never thought I'd find happiness again after everything," I admitted quietly. "But with you, it feels like I've finally come home." She squeezed my hand, her eyes reflecting the same emotion I felt. "We both deserve this, Alex. We deserve to be happy." And in that moment, I knew she was right. The past would always be a part of me, but it didn't define me. What defined me was how I chose to move forward, to embrace the future with open arms and an open heart. As we watched the sun set over the city, I realized that the best parts of my story were still ahead of me. And this time, I was writing it with someone who truly deserved to be part of it. It's strange how life circles back, sometimes offering the closure you didn't even know you needed. A full year had passed since I walked out of that house for the last time, leaving Jenna and all the chaos behind. In that time, I'd rebuilt my life brick by brick, piece by piece. But there was one thing left lingering in the back of my mind: the final chapter. It came in the form of a letter. One afternoon, as I was sorting through my mail, I found an envelope with Jenna's handwriting on it. For a moment, my heart raced, not out of longing or anger, but sheer curiosity. What could she possibly have to say after all this time? I sat down at my kitchen table, Max at my feet, and opened it. "Alex, I've been thinking about writing this for months, but I didn't know how to start. I know I hurt you. I know what I did was unforgivable. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted to say I'm sorry. Not because I want to clear my conscience, but because you deserved better. I hope you found happiness, Alex. You always deserved that more than I ever realized, Jenna." I read the letter twice, waiting for some wave of emotion to hit me. But it never came. There was no anger, no sadness, just a quiet sense of finality. It was like reading a story about someone else's life, someone I no longer recognized. I folded the letter and tucked it away in a drawer, not out of sentimentality, but because it felt like the right place for it. A chapter closed, filed away in the past where it belonged. That evening, Rachel and I sat on the balcony, watching the sun dip below the Seattle skyline. I told her about the letter, expecting her to react, but she just smiled softly and took my hand. "You okay?" she asked. That I nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "Yeah. I really am. And I meant it. Jenna's betrayal had once felt like the end of my world, but in reality, it was just the beginning of a better one. One where I learned my worth, found someone who truly cared for me, and discovered that happiness isn't something you stumble upon, it's something you build. Even from the rubble. As the city lights flickered on below us, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving, and with Rachel by my side, Max curled up at our feet, and the past firmly behind me, I knew one thing for sure: the best chapters of my life were still ahead.